The multi-win Emblem event is coming very soon, or by the time this video comes out, it is already out in Pokemon TCG Pocket. And the question really is, what deck will get you those 5 wins the easiest, and what decks will actually struggle for a variety of reasons? I'm going to go over a lot of them here in this video. Jake, your resident content cowboy, yeehaw, let's do this thing. So one of the trickiest things about an event like this, of course, is your deck needing a level of consistency that you might not be getting out of certain, even top meta decks. Sure, it's easy to get a couple wins, especially with something that's very coin flip heavy, but it's very difficult to secure your way to 5 straight wins in a row if you don't have certain Pokemon that are in your deck that are really consistent. So for starters, what kind of decks are going to work well for an event like this, and what kind of decks are going to struggle? And I've kind of given you a hint already. Things that rely heavily on a coin flip are going to struggle throughout this. For instance, let's talk about something that requires a lot of coin flips, like Marowak EX. Marowak EX is a pretty solid deck, and it works pretty well into a lot of the meta. It can even one-shot Mewtwo. However, if you happen to get unlucky with some of your flips, even running average luck, this could happen, but if you happen to get unlucky with some of your coin flips, all of a sudden your deck loses, and it's hard to maintain a win streak. Unfortunately, for a deck like that, you just run into problems. One way you can make this deck a little more consistent is to run Marowak with Primeape. In fact, Primeape is a pretty solid one for this event. However, it does have some unfortunate matchups into some decks we'll talk about that I think will be very relevant. Marowak Primeape here is nice because you have a few options that are not just based around throwing that bone meringue, and that can really make your games a lot more consistent. You can even add in a regular Marowak and not just a Marowak EX, so you're not dealing with all of those coin flips. The Marowak deck we're taking a look at right here is Marowak EX Primeape from Bodhi, taken from Pokézone. This has a Hitmonlee in it, which I personally have not really run with this, but I do see the advantage of running something like that. This is that new Mankey into Primeape. We have Cubone, Marowak, and Marowak EX. Moving on from Marowak, let's talk a little bit about Charizard. Charizard is a pretty dang strong deck, and it plays decently well into Mewtwo if you get it set up. And it's a little less reliable than Mewtwo because it's kind of just the inverse of Mewtwo almost, right? It's Moltres in front, and that powers up Char on the bench, whereas the alternative is Mewtwo in front with Gardevoir powering up Mewtwo. The advantages is with Mewtwo, you obviously are able to attack while you are powering up, and the advantages with Char is that Crimson Storm is able to do 200 damage. The problem with this is you will just as often, or maybe not just as often, but you will possibly run into situations where you don't get Charmeleon, you don't get Charizard EX, and your draws for energy, the power up that you're using to power Char, is based upon a coin flip. So this is a good deck. I like Char, but I don't think it's as consistent as some of the other stuff that you will see run. Unfortunately, when you're trying to get 5 in a row, Char could be pretty tough. You'll just get one game where you never find that Charmeleon in your deck, and there you go. Hey, this is Jake, somewhat in the future from that Jake in the other video. Did I just smack my microphone? Sorry about that, everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about Arcanine right here. I was originally calling it Arcmander, but everyone got mad at me, so I changed the name to Arcanine. This is an Arcanine Charizard deck, and the idea behind it is that Arcanine works well into the Pikas, and Charizard works well into the Mewtwo's. This is actually the more meta version currently of what you're seeing here. So it's Growlithe, Arcanines, Charmeleons, Moltres, Charmanders, Charizards, another Moltres EX in there, a Potion, X-Speeds, Pokeballs, a red card, Professor's Research, and Sabrina. Again, the advantage of a deck like this is it works well into 2 meta things that you might run into. Okay, back to other Jake in the video. Take it away, other Jake. Let's bounce on over to water-type Pokemon briefly. I think water-type Pokemon could be good for this event if you're playing low-cost water-type Pokemon like Starmie or something like that. Unfortunately, water-type Pokemon often take a ton of energy because of Misty. You could have some really good games with some high-cost water Pokemon and then some really bad games with water Pokemon. You also will be running into one of the most common decks, being Pikachu, and that can be a little tough, right? You are weak to just about everything on there, and a lot of things are going to be able to to start sweeping your team if you're running into a lightning type deck. I think a water deck would be okay for this event if, again, you are playing low cost. So a Starmie deck like this, I do think is decently solid. You have some options with it. You don't have to have everything as an EX Pokemon, but if you're just running something like Articuno or, you know, even Lapras, you're gonna run into some situations where you just don't power them. Speaking of just not powering, let's talk about Dragonite as a card. I can throw up a Dragonite deck here for you to take a look at. There's Dragonite with a Koga wall, there's Dragonite with a Lapras wall. There's like a lot of different looks that you could have for a Dragonite, but the big problem with this deck is if you just don't draw the energy, you will lose, making this a really inconsistent choice for a win streak. Unfortunately, I don't think Dragonite plays this particularly well. A Venusaur deck like this, Lilligant Venusaur, I think is a pretty solid option, but again, you are kind of running into the Charizard issues where they're just not as consistent. You also could run into a fire deck that really scorches you pretty fast. I think Executor, even though it is based on coin flips, would be a little more consistent in a deck like this. It's a really low energy cost, so you can start doing some damage early. But again, when you're looking at a win streak, when you have a stage 2 Pokemon that needs to be powered up slowly with grass or a little faster with Lilligant, but with a little less reliability, it's going to be hard to hit that 5-win streak. Now let's talk about some decks that I think actually play pretty well in an event like this. We're going to talk about the most powerful decks right now. I will start with Pikachu EX. Pikachu EX is still incredibly good in the meta, even though very recently another deck is sort of taking it by storm. There are a few different ways to build this, but the bread and butter of this deck is Pikachu EX and Zapdos EX. You could switch a few things out. You could run a Lieutenant Surge variant. I almost said Lieutenant Surge variant of this. You could go Voltorb Electrode. You could play Pincurchin. The basic idea of this deck is you will get a board full of Pokemon, and then Pikachu EX will be powered up with only 2 energy and start doing some crazy good damage. The thing about a Pika deck is, even if you draw poorly, it doesn't go that poorly. And that is what you're looking for when you are trying to hit a consistent 5 wins. Again, one of the best in the game, good against water, so if you run into a cheesy water deck, that's nice. Not bad into Mewtwo, but Mewtwo does give it some trouble, especially with the Mewtwo deck we're going to take a look at. Now let's talk about Mewtwo. The thing about Mewtwo, again, as I was saying a little earlier, it powers up and does damage while it is powering up. It only needs 2 energy to start hitting the enemies. It's a basic Pokemon, so it gets out there very fast. It can start fighting. As soon as you get guard, you're able to consistently hit for 150. There are no coin flips or anything involved. It is incredibly powerful, incredibly consistent, probably the most consistent deck in the game right now. In fact, in a recent string of tournaments, Mewtwo EX has been beating Pikachu across the board. Here is one reason why. We're going to take a look at a Mewtwo EX deck from EQKWS. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I'm positive I am. But Mewtwo EX, now with a regular Mewtwo attached to the deck, are giving you more time to set up this strategy. So you've got not only Mewtwo EX that can be powered up, you have Mewtwo, which can do a lot of damage, 120 with 4 energy. Sounds like the HP of a Pikachu, right? Then you also have the Mewtwo EX, where you're able to set that up with Gardevoir, and having a single lone Mewtwo in the deck is giving you the opportunity to have a wall that could deal damage and at the same time could go down and only cost you 1. This deck has really been sweeping in the tournaments, and again, it is outperforming Pikachu, which is really, really impressive. Another deck that I think is really consistent is using a Koga wall with either Wigglytuff or with Arbok. I think both of these are pretty strong. The nice thing about running Weezing and Arbok is you are actually playing pretty well into Mewtwo. Mewtwo can still do incredible damage if it gets set up, and it's not too hard to set that thing up, but the extra damage that you are dealing because you are a dark type deck running into Mewtwo is pretty nice, and you can outplay your opponents. You might run into some tough situations, but I do think Arbok and Weezing have a really, really strong opportunity in a win streak event, especially if you're skilled with it. It is a high skill deck and you need to make good decisions. Next is going to be Blaine. I think Blaine is a great deck because it is very, very consistent. The trouble with Blaine, just like any deck, is every once in a while you just don't draw well, or you run into your weakness and it's not going super well for you. But in general, Blaine works pretty well into a lot of decks because it is able to attack before your opponents get set up. It might be hard to be as consistent as Mewtwo and Pika, sure, but it actually plays pretty well into both of those decks, especially into Pika. You know, you can one-shot a Pikachu with a Ninetales and Blaine, so I think it's a pretty powerful option for a win streak event like this. Right now, we're going to take a look at a Machamp deck from Lobats that actually has played pretty well into a lot of the meta recently. Machamp is an interesting line because as soon as you get Machop out, it can attack Machoke, it can attack Machamp, it can attack one energy on each, and it's able to attack. You're pairing this now with Mankey and Primeape. You have a few different options of what you can do to your opponents. Unfortunately, of course, if you run into Mewtwo, you are dealing with that weakness, but in a recent tournament, this actually played pretty well into Mewtwo. So if you're looking for a fighting deck, something like this could be an option. I also think there are some great options for things like grass decks, things with Executor. I think Arcanine is rising in popularity a little bit. I have an Arcanine deck on my channel that I really like. In general, though, you're going to be running into a lot of Mewtwo. So I would recommend coming up with a strategy to deal with Mewtwo. And I think your best bets are going to be some of the decks we talked about. Arbok Weezing, I think, is very good. I actually think Wiggly plays pretty well into it, Wiggly Weezing. The nice thing with Wigglytuff is you hit one sleep in some of these situations and you win the game, which is really nice. A water deck doesn't play too bad into Mewtwo, but it can be a little tricky unless you hit your heads with Misty or you play really low-cost water-type Pokemon, but they can run into Pika, so it's a little dangerous. I think big picture, if you want the smoothest sailing, you're going to be playing first off something you're really comfortable with and something that plays okay into Mewtwo or Mewtwo. I do think Mewtwo is probably going to be the most consistent deck for getting a 5-win streak. I know that's not what we're going to be looking at doing when I stream this event, but I do think that is probably the best way to go. Pikachu is also insanely consistent, and something like that works really well. I would love to hear from you. What deck do you plan on playing to try to get 5 wins in a row? Let me know in the comments. When I stream this, I have a few different ideas, but I think we'll just play a deck, you know, suggested by the chat until we don't get the wins anymore and then move on to something else. Just seeing how many different fun decks we can try to hit 5 with. Oh, and before I go, again, shout out to PokemonZone.com where I pulled a few of these decks from, and shout out to the players who I have called out with these decks. Thank you so much, and enjoy that video that you just enjoyed. Boy, good outro.